Hello, I'm Mujahat Ahmed. I'm a visiting faculty at OB Jindal Global University. Today, our module is titled International Legal Protection of Elderly Rights. First, we will start with the learning outcomes, intended learning outcomes, to give an overview of the legal protection accorded to the various rights of the elderly in the international arena. To develop an overall understanding of the international as well as regional treaties pertaining to elderly and their rights. To critically understand the key principles relating to the UN Principles for Older Persons. 1991. Plans of Action on Aging and the CESCR General Comment Number 6 relating to economic, social, and cultural rights of the elderly. As already noted in the previous section, the elderly are facing a number of challenges in enjoying their rights. Consequently, they are increasingly being sidelined from the society, which, if not addressed immediately, will result in the total social exclusion of these people. In order to prevent this and protect the elderly from the ill treatment of the society and ensure them their fundamental human rights. Various efforts have been made to recognize the rights of the elderly and accord legal protection to those rights. However, with the focus on the human rights problems being faced by the elderly being relatively new, not much has been achieved in this direction, thus calling for a comprehensive legal instrument that accords complete protection to the human rights of the elderly. Now we will look at international law and the rights of the elderly. With the emerging challenges in the enjoyment of their human rights by the elderly, in the post-industrial era, there arose a necessity to legally recognize and protect the rights that are fundamental to the peaceful, happy, and dignified existence of the elderly. In this background, a series of efforts were made both at the international, regional, as well as domestic levels to accord legal protection to the human rights of the elderly people. The legal protection of elderly rights in the international echelon can be considered under the following heads: United Nations and elderly rights. United Nations, which is the modern day master of protection of human rights and peace at the international level, has time and again considered the issue of elderly rights. Accordingly, various efforts have also been made by the organization to protect the human rights of the aged. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. Let's have a look at the UDHR, 1948. What does it say about elderly rights? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which is the foundation of the contemporary human rights law, for the first time recognized the right to security of the elderly under the provisions of Article 25. This recognition of the rights of the elderly served as the basis for the formulation of various other documents in this direction, like Vienna International Plan of Action on Aging, 1982. This is another human rights framework we have to look at. The initial coordinated efforts for the recognition and protection of the rights of the elderly on the basis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948 were made in the year 1980, when the issue was incorporated in the United Nations agenda. Consequently, a World Assembly on Aging was organized in the year 1982 for the first time at Vienna, where 124 nations, mind you, of the world were represented. An international plan of action on aging was adopted in this assembly, known as the Vienna International Plan of Action on Aging. So, it was meant to assist and protect the elderly community. Then we'll look at what are the UN principles for elderly persons. So the UN principles for elderly persons, 1991. The Vienna International Plan of Action on Aging of 1982 was followed by the adoption of the UN principles for older persons in the year 1991 by the UN General Assembly Wide Resolution number 46/91. The principles were adopted to facilitate the implementation of the Vienna Plan of Action of 1982 by clearly identifying the various rights of the elderly persons. The UN principles for the elderly comprises of 18 principles grouped under 5 themes. So we are looking at 18 principles grouped under 5 themes. The principles acknowledge that the diversity in the elderly community, healthy advancement of age, and say the aging of population imposing a strain on the family life, and thus there is a necessity to support the elderly as well as those providing care to them. The rights of the elderly, as enshrined under the UN principles for older persons, 1991, can be summarized as follows. Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, 2002. The International Plan of Action on Aging was criticized by many scholars for the lack of age-based perspective. Later, in the year 2002, the document was revisited by the United Nations in the Second World Assembly on Aging, held in April 2002 at Madrid. A revised International Plan of Action on Aging, commonly known as the Madrid Plan, was adopted in this conference with the consensus of 159 nations. How many nations we're talking about here? 159 nations. Then there is the General Comment number 6 of CESCR on economic, social, and cultural rights of older persons. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, 1966, is one of the most relevant international human rights documents regarding the status of the elderly in the contemporary world. However, the convention does not explicitly refer to the elderly persons. To overcome this lapse, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the supervisory body of the convention, adopted a general comment on the economic, social, and cultural rights of the elderly. Adopted in 1995, the committee's General Comment number 6 provides the most comprehensive legal analysis of the rights of the elderly at the international level by interpreting the International Convention on economic, social, and cultural rights in the context of the elderly. By providing an insight into the different mechanisms for the implementation and protection of the elderly rights, the general comment expands the scope of the Convention and enables the development of a comprehensive set of human rights of the elderly people. So some of the rights of the elderly under ICESCR as recognized under General Comment number 6. Let's look at them. Equal rights of men and women, ICESCR Article 3. Rights relating to work, ICESCR Article 6 to 8. Right to Social Security, ICESCR Article 9. Protection of the Family, ICESCR Article 10. Right to Adequate Standard of Living, ICESR Article 11. Then we have the right to physical and mental health, which is under the article ICESCR Article 12. Then we have right to education and culture, which falls under ICESCR Article 13 to 14. Then there are other documents, certain other documents adopted by the United Nations that concern the elderly issues are as follows. Proclamation on Aging 1991. Second, 1992 General Assembly Resolution on 2001 Global Targets on Aging. Number 3, Integration of Older Women in Development, 1994. Number 4, Modalities for the Review and Appraisal of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, dated 2004. Then we have here is the UN Special Agencies and Elderly Rights. Some of the special agencies of the United Nations have also been contributing in the protection of the rights of the elderly persons in the form of either general comments or adopting conventions. Some of them are as follows. Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Then CESCR, General Comment number 14 on the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Next we have is CESCR, General Comment number 19 on the right to Social Security. Next is CESCR General Comment number 20, which on non-discrimination in economic, social, and cultural rights. Next comes CESCR General Comment number 21 on the right of everyone to participate in cultural life. Then we have the Committee on Civil and Political Rights. So what does it say about the rights of the elderly? The CCPR General Comment number 18 on non-discrimination. Then Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW General. Next we have the recommendation number 27 on older women and the protection of their human rights. Then we have the Committee Against Torture, CAT General Recommendations number 2 on the implementation of Article 2 of the Convention. International Labour Organization conventions, what they have to say about the elderly. International Labour Organization, ILO Convention number 102 concerning Social Security minimum standards. ILO Convention number 128 concerning invalidity, old age, and survivors' benefits. ILO Convention number 143 concerning vocation, guidance, and vocational training in the development of human resources. Next is the ILO Convention number 156 concerning equal opportunities and equal treatment for men and women workers. Workers with family responsibilities. ILO recommendation number 122 concerning employment policy regarding certain vulnerable groups, including the elderly. Next is the ILO recommendation number 131 concerning invalidity, old age, and survivors' benefits. The next is ILO's recommendation number 162 concerning older workers. Then we have the ILO recommendation number 166 concerning termination of employment. After that we have is the ILO recommendation number 202 concerning national floors for social protection. Then we have is the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization has also time and again dealt with the issue of the rights of the elderly, especially the right to highest attainable standard of physical and mental health of the elderly. Though not much of legal relevance, the World Health Organization has considered the concerns of the elderly from the biological and psychological perspective. That is, the science of health, and has issued comments to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights time and again to enable more effective protection of the human rights of the elderly. Then we have the other human rights instruments. So instruments applicable to elderly apart from the above human rights instruments, the ones we already talked about, apart from the above human rights instruments that particularly deal with the concerns of the elderly people, several other instruments pertaining to human rights are also relevant to the elderly and can be made applicable to them. Some of these instruments include International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, 1966. Then there is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, 1979. Next is the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, 1987. Next convention is on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Then we have the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and the Members of Their Families, 1990. Then we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, 2006. Next is the Toronto Declaration on the Global Prevention of Elder Abuse, 2002, WHO/INPEA. Let's look at elderly rights under regional instruments. Various efforts have been made at the regional levels as well as for the protection of the human rights of the elderly. Unlike the universal human rights instruments, several regional human rights treaties explicitly protect the rights of the elderly. This section deals with the protection of the rights of the elderly in 4 regions, namely Europe, Africa, Asia and Pacific, number 4, Latin America and Caribbean. The various human rights instruments concerning the rights of the elderly adopted at these regional levels, inter alia, include the following. Region legal framework concerning elderly. So starting with Europe, what is the regional legal framework for Europe? What are the primary instruments? Revised European Social Charter 1996, Article 23 along with Articles 12, 13, Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, Article 24, Community Charter of the Fundamental Social Rights of Workers. Next, Principles 24 and 25, European Convention on Social Security, 1972. Next we have is the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, policy instruments, resolutions. So what are the policy instruments? Resolution of 15 December 2000 on the Commission communication towards a Europe for all ages, promoting prosperity and intergenerational solidarity. COM 1999-221 C50185/1999/99. Resolution of 16 April 1999 on senior citizens in the 21st century, a new lease of life. A40160/1999. Resolution of the Council of 29 June 1995 on the employment of older workers, Official Journal C228/20209/1995. Declaration of Principles of the Council of 6 December 1993 to mark the end of the European Year of the Elderly and of solidarity between generations, 1993, publication OJC 343 of 21st December 1993. Resolution A40160/1999 on senior citizens in the 21st century, a new lease of life. So now we move on from Europe to Africa. What are the instruments in Africa? Africa, primary instruments, African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Article 18, African Union Policy Framework and Plan of Action on Aging, Protocol of the African Charter on Human and Peoples on the Rights of the Women in Africa, what is known as the Maputo Protocol, Article 22. Treaty for the Establishment for the East African Community, Article 120. The Kigali Declaration on Human Rights in Africa, Principles 17 and 20 Policy Instruments. Resolution on the establishment of a focal point on the rights of the older persons in Africa. Resolution on the rights of older persons in Africa. Resolution on access to health and needed medicines in Africa. Resolution of the transformation of the focal point on the rights of older persons in Africa into a working group on the rights of the older persons and people with disabilities in Africa. Report on the follow-up of the AU policy framework, which is the African Union policy framework, and plan of action on aging, establishment of an advisory council on aging. From Africa now we move on to Asia and Pacific. So what are the policy instruments in Asia and Pacific? Fourth Asia and Pacific Population Conference, Bali Declaration on Population and Sustainable Development 1992. Next comes the Fifth Asian and Pacific Population Conference Report and Plan of Action on Population and Poverty 2003. Next is the Roadmap for an Asian Community 2009 to 2015, Social Justice and Rights, Macau Declaration on Aging for Asia and the Pacific. Next is the Macau Plan of Action on Aging for Asia and the Pacific. Then what we have is the Shanghai Implementation Strategy, Regional Implementation Strategy for the Madrid International Plan of Action and Aging 2002. Now we'll move on to, from Asia and Pacific, we move on to the Latin American region, Latin America and the Caribbean areas. Primarily, we are looking at the primary instruments. So starting with American Convention on Human Rights, then we have is the additional protocol to the American Convention on Human Rights in the area of economic, social, and cultural rights, which is called the Protocol of San Salvador, Article 17. Then we have the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, Article 9. So policy instruments from regarding, say, elderly people from Caribbean Charter on Health and Aging, regional strategy for the implementation in Latin America and the Caribbean of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, OAS General Assembly. If you don't remember the full form of OAS, it's the Organization of American States. So the OAS General Assembly Resolution on Human Rights and Older Persons. So there's a need for a new convention on elderly rights. So let's talk about that. Why is there a need of such a convention? The elderly, as with all other sections of the population, have human rights as they are inherent to all human beings. Despite the fact that human rights laws are applicable to all members of the society, irrespective of their age, there exists a normative as well as an implementation gap with respect to the elderly. The provisions that directly address the concerns of the elderly and their rights are very few, while most of the approaches to the rights of the elderly are directed towards their development. The legal standards of their rights still remain unexplored, mainly due to the fact that the international legal mechanisms have not yet expanded their scope to meet their full potential regarding the issue. Consequently, the elderly are becoming more and more vulnerable and sidelined in the society. The United Nations and its agencies are continuously working towards the improvement of the collective well-being of the elderly. Accordingly, the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Aging was established by the General Assembly in the year 2010 to strengthen the protection of the human rights of the elderly by, number one, reviewing the extent up to which the existing human rights instruments address the rights of the elderly. Number two, identifying any gaps in protection of these rights. And three, exploring the feasibility of new human rights instruments. Since its establishment, the Open-Ended Working Group has been meeting every year to discuss and deliberate the status of the elderly in the contemporary world and devise mechanisms to ensure their well-being. Discussions are founded on the protection of the rights of the older persons and the necessity of the formulation of a new international convention dealing specifically with the elderly section of the populace and comprehensively recognizing and protecting all their rights. However, currently there exists a lack of consensus regarding the adoption of a comprehensive international legal instrument on the rights of the elderly. While some countries are of the opinion that the adoption of a new legal instrument on the rights of the elderly at the international level is grave necessity, few others are against this initiative. Thus, the issue of adopting a new international legal instrument on the rights of the elderly is an ongoing debate both at the international, regional, as well as the national levels. Now let's conclude and summarize. Aging brings with it particular vulnerabilities to discrimination and rights violations. Though various efforts are being made both at the international as well as regional levels to protect the rights of the elderly and ensure that well-being, not much progress has taken place in this direction. There is neither a comprehensive law enabling the elderly to enjoy the human rights on an equal basis with others, nor there have been explicitly provided protection under the existing legal instruments. The mentioning of the elderly people in the universal legal instruments is very rare, and wherever mentioned, it's in the form of a comment or a recommendation made by the committees. Thus, the need for the development of a strategy to adopt a comprehensive legal instrument on the rights of the elderly at the international level has gained focus. Thank you very much.